Ready for mic checks? All right, mic check 1 2 1 2. Mic check 1 2 1 2. Mic check 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2. Mic check 1 2 1 2. Mic check 1 2 1 2. Might need a white balance.
Can you do another quick mic check, please?
Sure. Mic check 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2. Mic check 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2. Mic check 1 2 1 2.
Text look all right?
Yes, looks great.
They also happen to be attached to the gas station near my apartment. So I go there.
I could have, but I elected chose to watch TV television.
That's entirely fair. I just didn't finish work until like. But it's okay because I knew I was going to the office right away this morning, so. I'll sleep in a little bit. Chill with the cat. Yeah. No, I don't, whenever she does, it's like, oh my god. Sneeze. Yeah, but not like a super regular occurrence. But this morning she was like, I'm going to puke on the carpet. I was like, fantastic. I'll just put that up. Yeah.
Sometimes actually work.
My cat, she was like, she'll get so excited to have some of her food. She eats it too fast. And her tiny body might not physically stay on that type of speed. And then she like bars it up. It's like, great, I'm glad that we did this.
I'm gonna look here.
I like the story you enjoyed with us. It was good. It's a good angle. The conservative young men. I don't know, I didn't know. I was trying to be like liberal Joe Rogan or whatever.
Apparently he's trying to go conservative places. So I think they're bringing conservative places.
Oh, okay. I mean, that could go many ways for him.
That would be great.
I don't know, I feel like they're like trying to replicate the like bro podcast. It's hard. That's crap. That's the bro. Yeah. I don't know if that's interesting. Yeah, I'm sure that's what's at the core of it, and if you can like blow up once in a while, tell someone off. Yeah, my of the wonderful white knight who I was positive Democratic primary in 28, my come from a hockey
Yes.
State Street, Georgia, John Mossop, they lived it.
You know
So
what I like?
much. Yeah, and he kind of like, I said, been like doing things, presumably. call. Like we would text you select, like all of the anchor text select, good colors. And I was in podcasters, it was Monica, and it was so called it out, but it's not. So that meant every percent was wondering for a while, it was like final year, focus is not. But yeah. Saturday. And I never listened to that podcast, but Friday was. I think I might have to make an exception and listen to the Friday. So I only and Christmas a lot. Yeah. So that was fun.
Those two guys from New York.
Yeah, I've never heard that.
Yeah, so they brought up this.
Yeah.
Sometimes I said they're having big out new TV to corner in our studio. I just have to very
Well,
well.
they-
Their podcast, that's what they talked about. There was that Kyle and Gelato.
I was wondering if you don't have
Consumption, you get all the correction.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, but it was like,
Like a Democrat.
yeah, it was tomatoes, yeah.
And like they talked about
Do you stop
it's
yourself?
not whole discussion testing, they don't know.
They don't know.
Because they thought it was serious. And I was like,
No. You don't have to go.
I was thinking you're so online. They're gonna call you. Oh, not quite right.
Yeah, you just got that wrong. That's
You are extreme? Yes.
The only podcast I've been listening to right now is Kristen Davis started a podcast about the Sex and the City. It's called Are You Charlotte? And I've been, yeah, I'm gagged by that, like,
It's so funny too.
Yeah.
If you watch that, I just like that.
I tried, I watched the first episode and I just couldn't.
It's crazy.
I couldn't go on, I was like, this is too much.
She probably talked to me.
It's the thing, I was like, the overly, like, overselling, so it's just like.
So some parts of it, we're going to college.
Just like my ass.
I think
Yeah, I think every
parts of it, like.
I just kind of like go see down.
I was equal
Area
there.
around that year.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's what I remember hearing.
No, I just hear it.
Like
Like last night.
But I like sat down. The whole like Miranda, like.
I gotta say, I don't like
Shade.
We're gonna get started in about 5 minutes, so.
I gotta say, I don't like.
No,
Like,
I don't think anyone liked
oh, I just think like she and Steve had that thing for 20 years.
Yeah.
And it feels like they resolved it and they should have left it.
Yeah. It does not everything has to be genuinely cute. I think they did that to make up for not having control. I didn't know they usually work in this.
I guess that they needed someone needs to have it.
Yeah, someone needs to have like a good life crisis.
Yeah.
I did think that she was dying on the Peloton.
Crazy.
I remember when it first came out and like this Peloton stuff. Because when they gave like the Peloton to the production crew, they thought it was gonna be like great promo.
Okay.
And they were like, you didn't die.
I think about that all the time, like, if it really happened, like, with the name brand.
Yeah.
Why do they have like this
I've heard different.
They could have totally spent like.
That,
Yeah.
no, it's like a room conference, our system.
Oh, okay. Yeah, there would be a really awkward.
Right.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
You know, like the instant movie stuff like Peloton. The. It was great.
I don't understand. They needed like
A lot of houses. I mean, you're silly. I'm actually like mid rewatch of the original series right now. And Steve has just been reintroduced. Yeah, it's too good. I was like, I was watching like the biggest movie in Paris episode. And my group chat, one of them started saying biggest movie in Paris. It's like we wanted to change it. So now, like, if everyone's talking about something, it's okay.
We're not like, these are all people. I don't have that ability, so.
Oh my God, yes, the the French hat and the French fry.
Happy birthday in my group chat.
So much work. She was like, I understand why some people are that older, but I'm like,
I honestly, now that I do insurance.
No, I think it's so funny, 'cause like, we're like, apparently like, this is like a big, like, read. I know when I saw yours. Yeah. And, yeah, that's what I was, I think we watched it on HBO.
Probably for about a year now.
It was like, I was reading about like, it was so many days of cut, and they were like, he's ruining Sex and the City, because they're pointing out all the stuff about it, that was like weird or bad. It's ridiculous. Yeah. And it's like, how weird is that, like, came out, like,
Crazy.
like, we're not saying you don't like, show, we're just saying.
But I meant the Benson person.
Like, it's real.
It's not worth it.
Yeah. Who does? Well, like, I'm thinking about like.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And it's like, it's so like. The whole. Oh my God, yeah. It's like, I don't think that kids are like really into the show, like, say on the internet, but that's not, because it is weird. Yes, yeah. Yeah.
Is the border of do they have that on the screen?
But the podcast,
I mean, this thing,
she's going back and she's like, going after somebody, so you're watching, she hasn't watched it. Yeah. So it's, and she's had on like some guests, she had on.
If it
like,
becomes a trend.
one of the writers, she had on. Like, yeah, like, that's like.
I think folks know
Yeah, like they talked about her, yeah, and she talks about that, and she's like, it was so good. Yeah, but yeah, it's fun, because I was like, I don't know, like, all this, but she talks about like, all of the students and writing and the process of getting cast and like getting the pilot. So it's fun. I need to catch myself up, maybe I'll do that while I'm writing this afternoon. It's like the unique ability to
No, we don't.
kind of turn my brain off, and not that I can still listen to because I still do the podcast while
Yep, that's good.
I'm writing.
All right, how was the committee?
Yeah, don't give up.
Yeah, trying. It's hard to get hopes up too, like we really care about. Well, she talked about that fine offers in the past year. And then like, good offers, in my opinion. The first time we go there, I do. I think it's just stable since we've been looking. Yeah. I don't know if they would come go down. I don't know, the state, like, most of the state buildings have been usually once you saw like your media for a meeting, but they're like, oh, go ahead. I can't believe that. I'm assuming no one's like that. Yeah. Yeah, my boss. Now we're taking it. Oh my God, the Trey Hall.
That was a great day.
Yes, just one. Just to be super practical about it, like, give the people what they want. What the people want, straight on them. And
We'll go.
for us.
All right, just come down the hall.
We're gonna
See you all. It's been a minute. Does everyone want to join? Buddies? Thanks, guys. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Happy day after State of the State. I hope you had all early nights last night. We all did. Thanks for being here today. Glad to be joined by my good friend, Senator Jeremy Moss, and a great champion for democracy, alongside my longtime and very good friend, Rep. Stephen Wooden. In West Michigan for a long time. Melanie Macy, part of the really great organization Promote the Vote, and of course Kyle Zawacki of ACLU of Michigan. Thank you guys for being here, along with our Deputy Secretary of State, Agogo Adevier. Terry Pruitt, President of the NAACP Saginaw branch, was unfortunately not able to be here due to a conflict, but we appreciate his effort in being a part of this as well, because we're here today to hold the line on democracy in Michigan. We have spent the week talking about real solutions for Michiganders, including yesterday at the governor's State of the State. But while we've been doing that, the president's allies in Congress have a plan in motion to block millions of American citizens from casting their ballot in future elections. Now, it's called the SAVE Act. They've introduced this bill to, sound like a reasonable election reform. But it takes something we all support, because we know it's true that only U.S. citizens should vote in our elections, and then uses that fact as a cover to gut voting protections for hundreds of thousands of Michiganders, eligible U.S. citizens with a constitutional right to vote. So I'm here as Michigan's Secretary of State and Chief Election Officer to say that's not going to happen on our watch. I work side by side with dedicated local election officials in every community. And all of us, Democrats, Republicans, independents alike, we are deeply committed to ensuring that every valid vote and only valid votes count in every election. And we've been successful at doing that. Michigan's elections are as secure and accessible as ever before. Take the 2024 general election, which was the third consecutive election in our state with record-breaking voter turnout. More than 5.7 million citizens cast a ballot last November. That's nearly 80% of all active registered voters in Michigan. And that was the third highest turnout rate in the nation among eligible voters, more than 10 points higher than the national average. And we were one of just 6 states with a higher turnout rate in 2024 than we had in 2020. That's cause for celebration, success, and gratitude to our election officials, not grounds for policies that would make it harder for us to do our jobs and repeat that success. Now, MIT's Election Data and Science Lab has ranked Michigan now number 2 in the nation for secure election administration. When I first took office, we were 31. But now we're number 2 because of the policies that folks like here and citizens all across our state have pushed for as voter protections in our state constitution and in our law. The SAVE Act would put all of that in jeopardy. That bill is not about election security. It is a trick because it is already illegal for non-citizens to vote. And when it does happen, it is very rare. Like other cases of illegal voting, non-citizen voting accounts for less than 0.0000002% of ballots. That's a decimal point with 5 zeros in it. Maybe I said more than 5 zeros, but it was just 5. We can and we must take every reasonable effort to ensure only U.S. citizens are voting. But the SAVE Act is not a reasonable effort. The SAVE Act would stop millions of Americans from registering to vote by requiring voters to register in person with either their birth certificate or a U.S. passport. Now, here in Michigan, voters can easily register to vote with a driver's license, state ID, military ID, and other documents that most of us carry around every day. But under this SAVE Act, none of those documents, not even a Michigan Real ID, which if anyone's gone to the airport recently, you know I want everyone to get your Real ID, but even that would not be enough. Only states and other states that have tried this already have found that it has always had the same result. It blocks thousands of eligible citizens from casting their vote. Who is the SAVE Act most likely to silence? Michigan women, especially married women. More than 2.2 million women in our state have married names that are not the same as the name on their birth certificate. 2.2 million. And if those women who have changed their names don't have an updated US passport, they might not be able to register to vote. But women aren't the only Michiganders who would struggle to produce the right legal documents. The SAVE Act would make it harder for seniors born in their family home, for victims of house fires, tornadoes, or floods, for college students who may not have immediate access to their documents back home, for people who were adopted in the United States or overseas. This bill makes it harder for all of those citizens to participate, and also tribal citizens, low-income earners, people in rural communities, Black Michiganders, and active duty military service members. So this SAVE Act and these proposals not only block Americans from voting, but they also make it so much harder for our election administrators and more expensive for our administrators to do their jobs as well. Because voters would lose the ability to register to vote by mail or online. So that means every time a voter updates their registration or moves, they'd have to go in person to a clerk's office with all of the required documentation. Local election clerks would then have to work one-on-one with voters to find and verify the documents they need. This makes government less efficient and more intrusive. So we're here today to raise awareness about this and ask for your help, because we need to get the word out to every voter in Michigan that this proposed SAVE Act and the proposals like it percolating not just here in Michigan, but all across the country will deeply be destructive to our American democracy. We have to help all voters know what's at stake. Now, are we saying that we are 100% fine with the status quo and that we should just accept everything the way it is? No, I've talked about a lot of successes today in our election system, but as my predecessor, one of my predecessors, former Secretary of State Candace Miller always said, the biggest room is the room for improvement. So of course, there's always opportunities to make our election system better. All of us here today, especially those who are elected and entrusted by the people to serve their best interest, all of us are here because we want to solve problems. We want to learn from our past experiences to develop sound, data-driven policies and adopt best practices that continue and will continue to make Michigan's elections the most secure and accessible in the nation. That is what we've done together so far that has led to the successes I've talked about. And now is not the time to do away with all of that, because we will not just settle for doing the things the way they are, but what we're not going to do is take a chance on and take a chainsaw to a system that generations of leaders worked together to create and ensure that all citizens can make their voice heard at the ballot box. We're not going to trample the rights of the many to elevate the power of the few. And that's what's really at stake here, because our democracy is made up of citizens, not corporate shareholders. And we're working together on a plan, the Michigan Election Security Act, to improve current laws, codify existing processes, and learn from successes in other states. The Michigan Election Security Act will provide additional tools to help ensure eligible voters can easily register and vote, while helping election officials more effectively identify and remove ineligible voter registrations. We will have more details on the Michigan Election Security Act to share in the coming days, but I'm grateful for the lawmakers who are here with me today and all across our state who are dedicated to not taking a chainsaw to our elections, but instead working strategically and in a data-driven, solution-oriented way and a bipartisan way with stakeholders at the table and having discussions about what to do to make our system better. In this moment, I'm urging any state or federal lawmaker who is truly interested in strengthening the security of our election system and using data and best practices to do so, to work with us on plans like this, instead of introducing proposals that would be dangerous, destructive to our voters and to our election system. So now I'm going to turn it over to Senator Jeremy Moss, who has been a tireless defender of democracy here in Michigan as chair of the State Senate Elections and Ethics Committee. Senator Moss.
Thank you, Secretary, for inviting me to join you at this press conference. I'm not ambushing this one from the front row. It's great to be here. And as the Secretary said, as chairman of the Senate Elections Committee, working with the Secretary and clerks throughout our entire state, we've put a tremendous amount of effort the last couple of years to build upon the successes in our election system. The prior term, we had a Senate Elections Committee that chased after conspiracies and lies and uplifted hurt feelings from those who lost an election. We took the opposite course. We uplifted truth and data, and we've achieved a lot of success on improving our election system here in the state of Michigan. And as a result, we've reduced barriers to voting and we've increased access to the ballot box. And the whole country has watched Michigan make this progress. The Institute for Responsive Government issues an election policy progress report each year for the last several years to measure how democracy functions in each state in our country and scrutinizes how citizens can participate in elections. In 2022, Michigan got a C+ on that report. But working together with our legislators and our Secretary of State, in 2023, we jumped right up to an A+, and we've maintained that ranking in 2024, one of only 3 states in the country with that ranking. We are always looking for opportunities to improve our systems. We have demonstrated that we will put in the work. But Republicans, both federally and sadly in the Michigan House of Representatives, are trying to do is roll back that progress and leave citizens out of the voting process. It is dangerous to our democracy, and it is a contrived distraction from real issues facing Michiganders. These are people who want to relitigate the 2020 election over and over and over again. And I don't know about you, but I cannot live in 2020 forever. So I'm here today as an eager partner to our Secretary of State to identify issues, as we have in the past, to resolve, to ensure equal access for all citizens in Michigan to express their constitutionally protected right to vote in each election. I'm also very excited to have a new partner in the Michigan State House in State Representative Stephen Wooden, who is now the vice chair of their counterpart to our committee in the Senate, who shares those commitments and who shares those values to uphold our democracy. And I want to pass it along to him.
Thank you, Senator Moss, and thank you, Secretary Benson. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephen Wooden. I am the newly appointed Democratic Vice Chair of the House Election Integrity Committee. But most importantly, I am the husband of one of those 2.2 million Michiganders who may have their voter registration jeopardized because of the change of their last name. And I am not going to let the smartest member of my household be denied the right to vote. And I am excited to be here to make sure that we maintain Michigan's phenomenal record of keeping our elections secure, safe, and accessible, and making sure that we go from number 2 to number 1. After Michigan saw its 3rd consecutive record-breaking turnout election, we know democracy is alive and well in this state. Yet still, politicians in Washington and in this state and across this country are trying to cherry-pick examples to create an excuse to pass damaging laws that would remove tens of thousands of voters in Michigan and deny them their right to vote under the guise of proof of citizenship. Now, as we've heard from our other partners today and from Secretary Benson and Senator Moss, we are all willing to consider reasonable efforts to improve our democracy and occupy that large room for improvement. But we've seen attempts to pass laws like these in the past. Arizona has had a law like this for 20 years, and it has been a complete failure. It has caused chaos and confusion and denied tens of thousands of voters in that state the ability to vote or jeopardize their right to vote. Policies like these are like taking a chainsaw to our democracy. And as someone who has used a chainsaw in the past, I know this for a fact. It may get the job done, but it's going to cause a lot of damage in the process if you're not using it right. Instead, let's look for reasonable solutions and bring the fine-tuned scalpel we need to improve our election system, to take us from number 2 to number 1 in the state, because I know we have the best and the brightest here to make that a reality. And I look forward to working with Senator Moss and Secretary Benson to accomplish that task and to stand up to any attacks on our elections and ensuring that every citizen in this state has the right to vote. And to speak more about how we can do this, I am pleased to bring up one of our many great partners, Melanie Macy from Promote the Vote. Excuse me, I'm a new guy.
Thank you, Representative Wooden, and also Secretary Benson for inviting me here today. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Melanie Macy, and I serve as the Policy and Government Affairs Director for Promote the Vote, a nonpartisan coalition of partner organizations committed to ensuring that Michigan's voting system works for all. I'm also a 20-year Michigan voter, and this year, for the first time, my household will have 3 voters. My oldest daughter, Katie, received her voter registration card in the mail last month after she turned 17 and a half. She had registered online last year when pre-registration became available, and she was thrilled and a little surprised when her card arrived. For her, the registration process was seamless, and she's excited to cast her first ballot this year. As you've already heard today, the SAVE Act would create unnecessary, burdensome barriers to voter registration. These barriers could prevent hundreds of thousands of eligible American citizens, including thousands of Michiganders, from voting. This isn't solving a problem, it's creating a new one. It's not what Michiganders need, and it's certainly not what we want. In fact, Michigan voters have made our priorities crystal clear in recent years, supporting measures making voting more accessible. Most recently, in November of 2022, Michigan voted overwhelmingly to add the provisions of Prop 2, or Promote the Vote 2022, to our state constitution. Proposal 2's common sense provisions expanded access to the ballot while maintaining the security of our elections. Thanks to Prop 2, Michigan voters have important new rights, like 9 days of early in-person voting, the ability to sign up to automatically receive a ballot by mail before each election, and more time for military and overseas voters to return their absentee ballots. These are real solutions, tangible improvements that have made it more convenient for millions of voters to participate in our democracy. Michigan's improved voting options matter. They matter for voters with disabilities, for whom voting on election day presents additional hurdles, including inaccessible polling places. They matter for voters with multiple jobs or caregiving responsibilities who simply can't make it to the polls on a Tuesday. They matter for military personnel overseas who may rely on timely ballot delivery across an ocean. Prop 2 ensured these voters' voices won't be silenced by the often complicated logistics of everyday life. And these new options were a hit with voters all across the state. Turnout in November 2024 election was record-breaking, the highest in our state's history. Almost 2 million voters have already signed up for the permanent mail ballot list, and more than 1.2 million voters cast their ballots before Election Day at an early voting site. Michiganders are using the rights they fought for and voted for to grow a culture of voting and civic engagement in communities across our state. And now the SAVE Act threatens to strip them away. The proposed policy will dismantle the voter accessibility that millions of us just voted to secure, as it would require in-person presentation of citizenship documents. The SAVE Act undermines automatic and online voter registration, creating new obstacles after we just voted down the old ones. And it creates confusion about absentee voting eligibility, potentially removing voters from the permanent mail ballot list just one short year after voters signed up for this permanent service. In short, the SAVE Act dismantles the rights that Michigan voters just overwhelmingly affirmed at the ballot box in 2022 and took advantage of in 2024 with record results. Michigan voters have spoken, and the message is loud and clear. We want voting to be secure and accessible for all eligible voters, longtime voters like me and first-time voters like my daughter and everyone in between. We know that our democracy works best when all our voices are heard, and we call on our legislators to focus on reaffirming the will of the people and protecting the right of every eligible Michigander to cast their ballot. Up next, we have Kyle Zawacki, the Legislative Director for the ACLU.
Thank you, Secretary, Senator, Representative Melanie. My name is Kyle Zawacki, and I'm the Legislative Director for the American Civil Liberties Union of Michigan. The ACLU is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting and advancing the civil rights and liberties of all the people in our state. Our mission is to ensure that the promises of within the Constitution and the Bill of Rights are protected and upheld, especially the right to vote. I'm here today to express the ACLU's strongest opposition to the SAVE Act and any legislation that threatens our fundamental right to vote. Before joining the ACLU, I was a high school civics teacher for a decade. One of the many joys of teaching was seeing my students register to vote. Every year I saw dozens of young people, many of them the first in their families to take part in an election, excited to engage in our democracy. They understood that voting wasn't just a privilege, but a right and a responsibility. The enthusiasm they brought to the process was an inspiring reminder of what's at stake when we talk about access to the ballot. Proof of citizenship laws create hurdles that prevent voters from exercising their rights, all under the false pretenses to prevent non-citizens from voting, an issue that is virtually non-existent and definitively proven not to be widespread. Anti-voting access laws like these have been implemented and then struck down in other states already. They clearly demonstrate the ineffectiveness and harm on voting access. And we know what will happen in Michigan if these restrictive laws come here. When Kansas enacted a similar law in 2013, a federal court found it unconstitutional based on the severe burden it placed on qualified Kansans attempting to register to vote, more than 30,000 of whom were unfairly denied the ability to register. And in Arizona, these laws have led to more than 47,000 of eligible voters being denied registration, particularly harming tribal citizens, Latino, and naturalized citizens community across their state. There's been no evidence of widespread fraud, but these laws will cause widespread disenfranchisement. These laws do not prevent fraud, they prevent democracy. They do not prevent fraud, they prevent democracy. And Michigan cannot go down that same road. Democracy works best when it is accessible, fair, and inclusive, not when it is manipulated by fear and misinformation. Instead of creating barriers, our lawmakers should focus on expanding access to the ballot, strengthening voter education, and ensuring that every eligible Michigander can exercise their constitutional rights without unnecessary obstacles. The ACLU of Michigan will fight this legislation at every turn, in the legislature, in the courts if necessary, and in the communities that are most affected by them. We urge our elected officials to reject the SAVE Act and any effort to undermines the right to vote. Thank you.
Thanks, Kyle. I know I speak for everyone here when I say that we're all committed to fighting to protect the voice and the votes of every citizen in this state and ultimately in this American democracy. And we believe it's possible to do so while working together in a nonpartisan, bipartisan way, with leaders from both sides of the aisle dedicated to continuing to using data and facts to strengthen and secure Michigan's already secure, accessible election system. But the SAVE Act and proposals like it are not the way to do this. They are not what they pretend to be. They are not the reasonable, constructive solutions that lawmakers pushing for them claim that they are. Every Michigan voter should evaluate the SAVE Act and bills percolating through our legislature and throughout the country with eyes wide open, with a critical mind and a clear understanding of what's really at stake. Now I'm happy to take some questions.
The SAVE Act appears this was introduced several months ago. What's the urgency behind it now? Why are you bringing it to the spotlight now?
Well, it's coming up for a vote either this week or next week, and it's making its way through the halls of Congress is one thing. But frankly, the impetus for talking about this today is born out of conversations that we have had throughout the state of Michigan with folks who just veterans organizations, women's organizations that clearly were not aware that this was even under consideration. And then hearing stories, just over the last couple of days, in particular, from veterans organizations and leaders out in West Michigan, where Rep. Wooden represents folks who were saying, oh, this would really affect me personally, and I'm really worried about it, and I haven't heard anything about it. And so that's why we wanted to come together today to raise the alarm in a more significant way, in a more immediate way, because I do believe over the next few weeks, you'll see this conversation happening in Congress and even here in Lansing about proposals like these. And for us to also say, look, we're not just here to say this is bad policy, but we're here to work towards good policy. We recognize there's always improvements to be made, and there are a lot of good best practices out there we can continue to bring to Michigan. We want to have that conversation, not these more destructive, not conversations around these more destructive policies. And we want the citizens of Michigan and all around the nation to join us in those conversations.
Last year in Ann Arbor, we
Yeah.
had a Chinese national
Mhm.
vote. The system didn't catch him. We only found out because he told someone. His vote counted because it had already been submitted. What would the Michigan
Election
act that
Security
you're-
Act. Mhm.
What would it do short of requiring birth certificate or passport to ensure that that doesn't happen again?
Well, there are other types of identification requirements we can explore in limited circumstances like that, where you have a student registering for the first time at a campus location. Those are the types of more honed in conversations we should be having to get.
But they could be national, foreign nationals can be in any part of the state,
Mhm.
not just in a college town.
Yeah, but what I'm saying that what you had in that circumstances with someone registering in a satellite office on an election day and not having to present certain types of identification prior to that. So those are the types of conversations we can have about how to not just ensure individuals in those situations are complying with the law, which in this case, you had someone who lied multiple times about their citizenship, who arguably knowingly knew they were breaking the law. And you can have that in any scenario in which someone is going to intentionally try to defraud the system. People can show up with fake documentation, for example, if they're intent on doing that. In that case, the Ann Arbor City Clerk took swift action when that occurred. There are policies that we can discuss, and we are discussing with lawmakers about how to ensure in those very, very isolated, rare, and limited circumstances that there are opportunities to ensure those ballots don't count. Those are the types of conversations we want to have, not ways to sort of broadly change the entire system because of one very isolated, rare circumstance. So in my view, and having been Secretary of State now for 6 years, this was the only case out of millions of people voting where there was any credible evidence that a non-citizen broke the law, arguably intentionally, allegedly intentionally, and illegally cast a ballot. That happens particularly when citizens or residents themselves are lying and knowingly saying I'm a citizen when I'm not. So those are the types of things we do want to talk about, we do want to address, and we do want to ensure we minimize even more than we already have, and that we're also grateful for the swift action that was taken to ensure the law was followed here ultimately and enforced, and this person will be facing very serious legal consequences. So all that aside, that's the conversations we want to have. How do we prevent those things from happening again in the very limited, rare circumstances? And what we're here to say today is you don't have to rewrite and destroy our entire system of elections or impose all of these onerous requirements on all of Michigan voters because of these very, very rare isolated incidents. Instead, we should talk about how to, in a narrow, more focused way, more specific way, how to address those circumstances. There's simply, in my view, no justification for enacting policies that will deny tens of thousands of citizens the right to vote in the next election because of this single isolated case.
Secretary, some folks have talked about the idea that if the SAVE Act were to be signed into law, it costs right now somewhere between $150 to $200 to renew or get a new passport. And some folks have argued that that amounts to a poll tax. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, I mean, that is another example of the onerous requirements of that. And what I'm particularly worried about is this sort of predicating all of these hoops and requirements on legal eligible voters that would then, have to go through those hoops in order to have their constitutional right to vote affirmed. I think the other two things to remember here, though, are the way in which this would change how elections are administered as well. Not just the examples I talked about, but the criminalization that's also in these bills of election officials who would be doing the right thing and not, and registering eligible citizens, but because they didn't check the right box or have the right documentation or whatever, might also become criminally liable, these clerks might, if they somehow make an error that would still allow an eligible citizen to vote, but would not follow all of the rules in this very onerous, complicated set of requirements in the proposed act. So the challenges that election officials would endure in those situations would drive many professionals out of the arena at a time when we need experienced election professionals to be in their jobs, treated well and supported.
Secretary, you have been talking about how this would be very onerous as well as proposals like this. Were you referring to the proposal from Michigan Republicans to require proof of citizenship to vote in Michigan elections?
Yes.
Can you speak a little bit more to, the legality of that, and how maybe that is similar to Arizona's case?
Yeah, I think the examples we've talked about show how proposals like that aren't just happening in Michigan, but across the country, would be, again, akin to really taking a chainsaw to our election system while we're trying to address sort of one specific isolated circumstance. So that said, we're willing to work and talk with lawmakers on all sides of the aisle to make data-driven decisions, also involving clerks in the conversations as well, which we need to do to make cogent, smart election policy. None of those conversations are happening. What this appears to be is an effort to take isolated circumstances, extrapolate them out to completely change an election system that would ultimately result in taking us backwards and having less people voting than before and making it more difficult for eligible citizens to participate in our elections. Our job, and I think one of the reasons we're all here, is because we want to make sure citizens know that these conversations are happening. Again, not just in Michigan and not just even at the federal level, but in states around the country. Politically charged conversations, partisan-driven policies that would overall, at a time when you could argue we need more citizens to be voting and engaged and holding elected officials accountable than ever before, this would make it harder for them to do that. And that's why we're deeply concerned.
Do you think that because of the federal requirements, because the SAVE Act is not in place right now, that this proposal in Michigan, if it were to be put into place, would that hold in a court challenge?
No, I don't. I think it's possible that it violates the constitutional protections that citizens themselves, like a right to vote for citizens, enshrined in our state constitution. And so those are the types of conversations that I think many of us that we brought to light in the weeks that follow this conversation and others. But we're here to say that this is a moment for the residents of Michigan, the citizens of Michigan, the voters of Michigan to know that while you've enjoyed all of the expanded options to vote and the enhancements and improvements in our democracy these last several years, there are efforts afoot at the national and state level to do away with them. And we need your help to helping protect our existing system and protect every resident, whether you're Democrat, Republican, or independent, every citizen's ability to vote in our elections, and through doing so, hold their elected officials at the state and federal level accountable.
Two questions, just to follow up on Steve's question. First of all, can you give some specific examples of what sort of policies could like toughen laws about non-citizen voting without, stepping over that line of being unconstitutional? And then also, has your office considered or conducted a review of same-day registrants from the last election to potentially identify other non-citizen voters?
Yes, we're in the process of doing that to understand. Again, I'm a data person, and so I want to know what the data is. So that number I mentioned earlier with the 5 zeros, 0.00002%. Did I say that right this time? 0.00002%. That comes from that research. That comes from looking at not just 2024's election, but a number of elections, not just same day, election day registrants, but all registrants. So we're doing that work, and what we found is that is how rare it is. It's that sort of very, very, very minute percentage of incidents that are occurring.
Narrow it to the same day registrants, you might have a larger percent that are using that loophole.
Well, yeah, that's one of the things we're looking at. And certainly in the case in Ann Arbor, you had an individual who used a student ID. Everyone who gets a driver's license or state ID in Michigan has to show documentation. And in that documentation, it shows whether or not they're a citizen or not, or whether they're naturalized. So if you have a limited circumstance like this individual who didn't have to show a license or ID, that also created a loophole and opening for the lies that he stated allegedly on his application to vote to make it way through the process. So again, when an individual is intent on lying and actually intentionally defrauding the process, there are oftentimes very difficult ways to catch that ahead of time, no matter how many onerous requirements we put in place. However, on the other side of things, we can, and we are having conversations about strengthening those election day policies and procedures to ensure in these limited circumstances, we're able to catch these incidents as they're occurring and ensure those tainted ballots don't enter into the machines themselves and get counted into the results of the election.
So what are those specific policies? Would it be like a provisional ballot, or?
It could be it could be a number of things, and that's what we're having conversations with lawmakers around right now. It could be policies that enable us to track and retrieve those ballots. It could be provisional ballot. It could be additional verification or residency requirements at that moment. So in those limited circumstances, I do want to have those conversations, and that's what we're talking about today with a real Michigan Election Security Act that would enable us in those very limited circumstances to require additional either verification or on the other end, enable us to retrieve ballots found to be faulty so that we could move forward and assure the public that those very, very isolated incidents, though rare, though isolated, that we have additional provisions in place to ensure they don't reoccur. And again, that's also the purpose of us coming together today to say we want to have those conversations. Those are and again, recognizing, let's take retrievable ballots, for example. Moving forward on a policy like that, we need to bring the clerks to the table. We need to talk about funding. We need to make sure exactly how we would make this operational. I'm happy to have those conversations with lawmakers about that specific piece. And I think that's what we're here talking about and wanting to propose.
Secretary, I was just taking a look at a news article here. Congressman Roy, who's sponsoring the SAVE Act, said that there's a clause in the SAVE Act that leaves it up to the state to establish a process for applicants to provide additional documentation to the appropriate official in case of a discrepancy in regards to the documents. So it would seem like you or legislators would have the ability under the SAVE Act to take care of situations like married women. Doesn't this give you some type of comfort that there's some provisions in here?
I appreciate the one shout out to states' rights that seemed to be previously so important to lawmakers at the federal level in that regard, but that comes within a greater context of having a lot of additional onerous requirements that states must comply with, and certainly again would perhaps provide us to provide alternatives or alternative scenarios, but you'd still have to provide that additional documentation, and it would be in circumstances where you can't, that states can figure out other options. All we're saying, in addition to all of that, is that onerous requirements, all of these additional pieces that we'd have to do, it's not necessary. And there's no evidence, frankly, that it would have stopped the very isolated incidents that we have of ineligible citizens from participating. There's no evidence that would have stopped them either, if anyone's intent on lying and all the rest. So that lack of evidence, that lack of connectivity, that lack of data, those examples from other states where these types of things have been tried and have actually just led to lower turnout and disenfranchised far more citizens than even the drafters might have intended. What we're here today to say, like, that's the data that worries us, not, one sort of carrot thrown to the states that says, well, we'll give you a little bit of leeway if you need to find alternative ways of identifying people. But that said, again, I'm always open to working with people on cogent solutions. The federal database, of non-citizens and having greater access to that is something that might help us, and it's something we want to talk about with lawmakers. Actually get specific data that would help us in those isolated incidents identify if there are any ineligible residents on our voter rolls. That's the type of policies we should be talking about, not implementing vast, universal, significant burdens on all citizens to participate in our elections, when the actual solutions to the problems that are at the heart of these types of conversations are actually far more specific and minute.
Are you afraid that somebody like this Congressman Roy is then putting up this proposal for political reasons?
I'm not afraid. I'm aware that he is. I fully believe he is. Yes. I mean, I think that is what is happening. These are partisan-driven proposals to further a political strategy. And what hits me in the gut the most is that these proposals are coming forward at a time when the fabric of democracy in our nation is being ripped apart by a lot of actions being taken at the federal level. And at a time when citizens, as I was saying earlier, need to be able to hold their elected officials accountable more than ever before, this is making it harder for them to do so. And so to me, it's part of a much broader political strategy to make it much harder for American citizens to ensure their power is at the center of decisions being made here in Lansing and nationwide, and instead shift power in this country to a corporate elite of individuals that, in my view, don't always have the best interest of the residents, the citizens of our state and all of America at heart.
A question for ACLU and Promote the Vote. At this point, have you identified any potential plaintiffs, or are you looking for plaintiffs in a lawsuit if this passes Congress and gets signed by the president?
We're always looking for plaintiffs and following that through. So the short answer is yes, but not actively until the laws pass. We'll always be monitoring how laws impact our citizens across the state and across the country. In other states, we have affiliates across the entire country, but we're always monitoring it.
So if the president signs this, you would file a lawsuit the next day?
If not the ACLU of Michigan, I'm certain that the millions of citizens who would be negatively impacted by this legislation would find themselves amongst them some plaintiffs that would come forward and push to ensure our Constitution is protected both in our state and nationwide.
Secretary, please excuse my ignorance on this question, but you mentioned that the ineligible student registered with their student ID. Is that something that if they were eligible is allowed? And if so, is that something you maybe would want to do a policy change on?
Yes, we were talking about. I think we need to look at other alternatives in those very, very rare and isolated situations where someone is registering and voting for the first time at a satellite office on election day. What additional verification requirements we may want to put in place in those isolated circumstances? So those are the types of conversations we want to have with lawmakers. But yes, it was what was illegal was putting on his application that allegedly that he was a citizen when he's not. Everyone who comes even in those scenarios has to affirm their citizenship, has to claim under penalty of the law that they are a citizen. So the law was broken. The existing protections in place were ignored by the alleged non-citizen who attempted to vote. So in that situation, and in many situations, our point is you're always going to have examples, though rare, of people who lie to break the law. You're always going to, no matter how many protections you put in a bank, you're going to have people who try to rob it. And sometimes even people who get through and successfully do. That doesn't mean you shut down the bank, right? It just means you try to find specific ways to make those banks more secure. And that's what we're saying today. We want to find specific ways to address those isolated circumstances. And we know we can do so without deconstructing the entire system and shutting down democracy.
Just a quick follow-up on that. So the like same-day registration, the student ID, was that in the Promote the Vote constitutional amendments, or was that statute? That was the legislature that put those provisions in place, or?
Well, this is also something that has happened with our previous Secretary of State too. I think there was an example of Canadian nationals who did it as well.
In 2018.
So, these are.
When someone is in, whether it was pre-our being in office in 2018 or in 2024, when someone's intent is to lie or to claim they're a citizen when they're not, that's possible regardless of what policies are in place, is kind of what we were trying to say.
Yeah, I guess I'm just wondering, like, if you were to make tweaks to the law to shore this up, would you need to reverse a constitutional amendment, or it would be a change in statute?
I wouldn't be interested in any tweaks that would require us to go against the will of the people and overturn or change the constitutional amendments. Okay, all right, thanks.
Thank you.
Good work. Yeah, thanks. Great job. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thanks.